Yeah, my name is Kristen McDonald. I'm the China Program Director at Pacific Environment, based in San Francisco. And the program that I work on supports grassroots groups in China that work on industrial pollution issues. I did grow up in Eugene, and I wanted to give a shout out to my father, Ralph McDonald, who's in the front row here. My folks were some of the first tourists to visit China during the 1970s following Nixon's visit as part of the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, which I think also deserves a lot of credit for reestablishing relations with China during that period. It wasn't just the people in Washington, D.C. Doing that work, but it was the goodwill of the people of China and people of the U.S. Bridging across and making cultural connections, and having philosophical discussions amongst themselves that helped to repair the relationship. My folks being involved in that definitely planted a seed for me in terms of being interested in building friendly relations with China and working in China in my career. I think it was really brave of them to seek to reach out to China at a time when it wasn't really popular to do so back in the 70s. I wanted to just give a little taste of memorabilia from that period. That is me. And for those of you that don't read China, it says Zhongmei Renmin Wansui, which is long live U.S.-China People's Friendship. So this is my credential that I hope will always get me out of trouble in China if I ever do get in trouble for the work that I'm doing there. It's really a nice honor to come back to the U of O and speak here. I really enjoy coming to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference that happens here every year. It's a really great event, and kudos to the U of O and the students here who put it on every year, bringing together legal scholars, activists, and contributing greatly, I think, to the culture of discussion and openness here at the law school. So I wanted to know a little bit about who all of you are. So I wondered if we could have a show of hands. How many folks have traveled to China? Raise your hand. Okay. And keep your hand up if you have lived or worked in China. Okay, great. So that gives us a sense of who we all are. Later, this is a town hall, so I definitely hope that we'll have some time for a discussion and sharing experiences later. If you know anything about China, of course, you know that it's a very huge, complicated country, and to talk about environmental issues in the space of half an hour is a completely impossible task. So I'm really going to focus today on the pollution. Number one question that I always get when I meet somebody on the bus and they ask me what I do: what's going on with China's air? So I thought I'd just launch into that right away. Oops. So air pollution in China is really bad. It's a huge problem for health. I talk to folks who raise their kids in China, in big cities in China, and it's heartbreaking. Their children can't go outside, hundreds of days out of the year. So, I mean, if you can imagine, your son or daughter sitting there by the window, Mommy, I want to go outside and play. No, you can't go out. I mean, it's really a tragedy. And of course, there's huge human health costs to this as well as to the climate overall. Air pollution is contributing to World Health Organization estimate is 1 million deaths per year in China. Another figure that I heard was twice that, 2 million, and that comes from the International Energy Agency. And what I found interesting about that study is that half of those are not from industrial air pollution, but from indoor air pollution. So what's indoor air pollution? That's rural cook fires. I don't know how well you can see this image. It's actually a really beautiful one. But it's also deadly, right? Using coal briquettes or wood in an indoor cook fire contributes to 1 million deaths in China per year. So this is something that I think we don't hear about as much. You know, we have this perception that China is this industrialized place, and air pollution is economic growth is causing all this industrial air pollution. We don't hear so much about what's going on in rural China and how indoor air pollution is equally damaging to health. Although I think it's surprising to some people to know that Beijing is not the world's most polluted city. It's not even on the top of the list. It's way down at number 76. Didn't even fit on this slide. And in fact, if you look at a list of the world's 100 most polluted cities, there's just a few that are in China. Most of them are in South Asia and Africa. So that sort of goes against the perceptions that we have, and I think there are reasons for that. I think that the Western media has done a good job of portraying China as the most polluted country in the world. And in some measures it is, but in other measures, other places are doing pretty badly as well. Of course, the major culprit for air pollution in China is coal burning for industry, for energy, as well as heating and cooking. By 2012, China was consuming half of the world's coal, and China remains the largest carbon dioxide emitting country in the world. So this is a major problem for China as well as the world. At the Paris climate talks, China pledged to peak its carbon dioxide emissions by 2030, and many regions of China are seeking to do that by 2020. And I think that those peaks are within reach for China, but I don't necessarily believe that that's going to be enough to keep us under the 2-degree warming limit. Last year, when we were visiting the State Department in Washington, D.C., I heard for the first time that the U.S. government really views the environment as the bright spot in U.S.-China relations right now. And we heard that in Steve Orland's talk as well just now. And I mean, I do think compared to the South China Sea and North Korea, we're not doing so bad on the environment. At last year's meeting, a historic agreement was made on banning the sale of ivory, which is really important because China consumes the most ivory in the world, contributing to the senseless, brutal killing of tens of thousands of elephants in Africa every year. So that's great that that's happening. And then the climate work is also really good. Obama and Xi made a joint commitment last year at their summit meeting. This past September, they jointly announced that both China and US would ratify the Paris Climate Agreement. I think this is promising, but as my little cartoon down below suggests, I think there's some shadows of doubt around whether we can actually follow up these commitments with the kind of action that will be needed. Coal consumption there are some good signs. Coal consumption has decreased in China over the last 2 years, partly due to the economic downturn, but also due to pollution concerns. And there's definitely potential for a lot more change in China in terms of clean energy. China definitely leads the world in terms of production of solar PV panels as well as installation of solar. I remember when I first got to China, you looked out across the roofside in the city, and all of the roofs had solar heaters, solar water heaters. And this is not something that gets a lot of attention, but I love this graph. I don't know if you can see it, the details, but that column on the right is solar hot water heater capacity, and the column on the left is the entire global solar PV capacity, solar water heating capacity in China versus the entire global solar PV capacity. So it's huge. China doesn't usually get a lot of credit for this. I also recently heard that in 2014, 1 year alone, China installed more solar power than the US has total, that we've historically added. So China's really accelerating in this department. And I think that the fact that it's really hard to shift a huge, complicated country away from fossil fuels, changing all the grid systems, shutting down polluting industries, laying off probably millions of fossil fuel workers. It's really hard to do that, and the fact that China's making aggressive steps, I think, deserves credit, and also is a good sign that there's potential for even deeper reforms in the future. So let's shift for a minute to water. Water is, of course, being from Eugene, my personal favorite of the 4 elements. And of course, it has to be on a week like this week. But I really, got started in my work in China because I was fascinated by the rivers of China, and I wanted to learn more about them. And before I started working on pollution issues, I worked on a project that Eric mentioned called China Rivers Project, where we looked at some of the Grand Canyons of China that were being dammed up for hydropower and tried to call attention to these special places. Places like the New River, the Jinsha, or the Upper Yangtze, Tiger Leaping Gorge of the Yangtze, and there's a shot of the Upper Yellow River. China's building a lot of hydropower in part to meet its demand for energy, also to try to get off fossil fuel. And if there's interest in sort of this aspect, I can talk more about it in the Q&A. I didn't want to say too much about it, but just a side note for now. The south of China has a lot of great water. The north of China and the west of China is a lot more dry, and you can tell by this rainfall map kind of how things look from a rainfall perspective. And I recently heard a statistic that there's something like 60,000 villages in northern China that have been displaced due to water scarcity. And this is an ongoing problem. Whole villages are having to leave their ancestral homes and move somewhere else. There's just not enough water available. This is a problem that's exacerbating, of course, with climate change. Lack of water is made worse by water pollution. The World Health Organization estimates that every year 190 million people in China fall ill due to lack of clean water. 60,000 people die every year due to gastric or intestinal cancers from drinking polluted water. And there's hundreds of cancer villages that have now been documented in China, which are places usually along polluted waterways where the cancer rates are just much higher than other regions of China. The good news is there is actually some improvement in terms of surface water quality in China in recent years. Due to public outcry, due to changes in pollution regulation, there's been some improvement. The downside is that statistics are showing that groundwater pollution is severely on the rise in China. What I heard recently was that the Ministry of Water Resources reported that more than 80% of the groundwater in China is unfit for drinking or bathing because of contamination from industry and farming. Next to air and water, the third sort of big pollution concern in China is soil pollution. This is something that doesn't get a lot of attention. The government of China is a little hesitant to talk about this issue very publicly because it has huge ramifications. But studies are showing that about 20% of China's agricultural land exceed industrial pollution limits and would cost about $1 trillion to clean this up. So if you sort of think about that, 20% of China's agricultural land, which is feeding a fifth of the population of China, that's a lot of people that are eating food from contaminated soil. It's a huge issue. Not too surprisingly, over the past decade, more and more people in China are getting fed up with the situation. Every year there's recorded something like tens of thousands of environmental-related protests in China. We don't hear about them too much, and of course protesting is illegal in China, but they do happen. And pollution issues are really, when you look at polls, they're at the top of people's complaints, right there, along with rising economic inequality and inflation. There's also there is, on the good side, a growth of environmental groups in China, who I think often don't get enough credit for some of the good things that are happening in China. There's dozens of very effective groups based in Beijing that work on policy issues, like a new environmental law that came out 2 years ago, which really made a lot of positive changes. But what I want to talk about today is grassroots environmental groups, because that's the issue that I work on most closely. The program that I lead provides funding, small grants, training, technical support, and mentorship to a network of groups in China that work on water and air pollution issues. And people often ask me, well, what can groups like these in China actually do about pollution? And the answer is a lot, and increasingly more and more. Although there aren't that many groups in China working at this level that I would call grassroots environmental groups, maybe 400 or 500 or so, they really have had a big impact. Shutting down probably tens of thousands of polluters, or getting them to clean up, engaging millions of volunteers in environmental efforts, and really sort of spreading the word. So many people in China are fed up about the problem, but often feel that they don't know exactly what to do. And these groups are really key in answering that question. One of the main tactics that they use is just getting information out there. In 2008, China passed an open information law, and this allows groups and individuals to write to their government and ask for information about pollution. So, what is this pollution? What is this pollutant entering my river? Why is it turning red? This factory seems to be continuing to pollute. Or do they have permits for this? Are they in violation of their permits? And they take that information and put it into user-friendly formats, like this map here, which shows all those dots are key heavy polluting industries that have had some level of environmental pollution, environmental permit violation in recent years. Of course, information alone is not the answer. Then you have to do something with it. And they do. What they do is they take that information and report it back to their local Environmental Protection Bureau and ask them to come and check out that factory or check out that outlet pipe and say, what's going on here? We need more information. You need to do something about this. And that quite rapidly leads to a lot of success for the groups. Another sort of new development in China is public interest environmental litigation. In the past and still currently, most environmental lawsuits in China are civil suits. So the typical case is a farmer will have their field polluted by a factory upstream. The farmer sues the factory, and the court orders some kind of minimal compensation for their losses. But since January 1st, 2015, when the new environmental law came into effect, NGOs have been allowed to bring public interest lawsuits against polluters, and something like 100 cases have been brought, which isn't enough. There should be many more than that. I think this number will rise as courts get used to the process and as NGOs get more savvy about what kind of cases they can bring and which ones will be successful. The environment, as I mentioned, for local groups working on environmental issues has really changed a lot in China because of political reforms as well as structural reforms. And I mentioned the 2015 new environmental law, which not only allows for citizen suits, but it also says that polluters can be fined every single day that they are found in violation of their permit. This is different from before, when there was just a one-time fine, and polluters really saw it as just the cost of doing business. Now it really will hurt their bottom line if they violate their pollution permits. And what's more, there's no ceiling on the fine that can be issued. So a lot of companies are taking action on their own, kind of seeing the writing on the wall in these past 2 years, installing proper pollution permits. And I think that's the reason why we're really seeing some good changes in terms of surface water quality in China. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about a couple of groups that I work with to give you a little deeper flavor for the kind of work that I do, as well as what grassroots groups in China are actually doing on the ground. One group is called, the first group I want to tell you about is called Green Hunan. They're based in Changsha in Hunan province. And they are an incredibly effective group in terms of mobilizing volunteers. They have a network of about 400 volunteer river monitors. And their motto is, every river needs a watcher. So they've set up these sections of river where there's one person that patrols that section, takes pictures, checks out what's going on, makes reports. They use a lot of social media. This is a graphic a picture that I took of a chart that they were using to track their progress in getting all sections of the Xiang River and its tributaries covered. So each of those little pods is a tributary, and then there's these little sections that are marked off, and the little dots, I don't know if you can see them, are the stations, and then they have little dots for the number of volunteers. So they're being quite scientific about trying to get everything covered in Hunan province. And often, just as I mentioned before, just getting the information out there and making it known is what gets results. So this is an example of a tweet that they did, a couple of them actually. The one in the middle is from a dye factory that was found illegally discharging wastewater directly into the Xiang River. You can see it's kind of turning the river a pink color. And this went viral on social media, then it went to traditional media, and then the local Environmental Protection Bureau got wind of it and shut down the factory, and actually the factory owner issued a public apology about this incident as well. This is something that happens all the time, and this is kind of the bread and butter type work that my partners are doing in China right now. But a little different challenge cropped up for Green Hunan recently I wanted to tell you about. They were founded in 2007, but a couple years prior to that, the city of Changsha decided they wanted to build a dam across the Xiang River. And Green Hunan staff told me, had we known about this, we would have tried to stop the dam from being built, because we know that it's really going to impact water quality in this section of river. All this wastewater is being directly emitted into the river. It's going to have no place to go. It's going to build up in the reservoir. Water quality here is already compromised. So they started investigating the situation, and they found out that there was actually an EIA that said that the city of Changsha was supposed to update all of its water treatment before the dam could be built. Was this being done? They found out through their pounding the pavement and looking at what was going on, they found that none of this was actually being done. They tried to raise awareness about this, get the media to pay attention, get the government to pay attention. It wasn't really working until they came up with this clever little social media stunt where they had 3 volunteers dress up in white hazmat suits, just stand by the banks of the river. Not really a protest, just a little photo op, and holding up signs that say public participation, the pollution in the river needs to be stopped. This went viral, and the media picked it up. The local government started paying attention. Actually, they had a huge break when the main newspaper in Changsha wrote a report, demanding that the government address this problem. So this is, pretty unusual when you get mainstream media to make that kind of demand. But from that moment forward, they started to get a lot more progress, and they've since been monitoring and making sure that on that section of river, the wastewater treatment systems do get upgraded as the reservoir fills. The second case I wanted to tell you about is Greenstone in Nanjing in Jiangsu province. This is a group that my organization started supporting in 2000. They were a student organization that quickly started developing a robust network of volunteers to track down polluters, put them on maps, get them to clean up. But what started happening in this region as Nanjing became a more wealthy region, a lot of pollution got put behind industrial park walls. So it was no longer something you could see. It was something that took a lot of sleuthing to try to figure out what was going on. And Greenstone wanted to figure out a way to try to daylight what was going on within industrial parks. And they decided that they had to cooperate. They could no longer just go about, in the back alleys taking pictures and getting the government to try to do something. They needed to work with the industrial park leaders themselves. So they started setting up roundtables, and they kind of billed it as education for industrial parks on open information laws. FYI, it's in your best interest to know, what the laws are concerning pollution information. And through that, they started developing these roundtables where they could then bring in local citizens to talk about their concerns with the industrial parks. And they were able to set up several hotlines, as well as a citizen kind of monitoring committee that regularly meets with the industrial parks to advocate for their concerns. So these are just a couple of examples I wanted to share with you about what groups in China are doing to address these severe pollution problems China's having. I think there's a lot that we also can do. And I think that, reflecting on Kissinger's remarks a little bit, I think we sort of really need to ask ourselves about this question of national interest. He used that term a lot. He's a national security advisor. Of course, this is something that he wakes up thinking about every day. And I think if we ask ourselves, do we want the people of China to continue to suffer from unending pollution issues? Of course, the answer is no. But I think that it's often convenient to think of China as this major pollution catastrophe that's just never going to be resolved. When in fact, I think that's not the case. And I think believing that it's never going to be resolved sort of helps prop up our own inability to examine our own role in causing a lot of, as Americans, as the most industrialized nation and the greatest economic power in the world, our own role in creating a lot of these problems ourselves. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can instead actually work harder to make connections. And one example that I love is here in the Pacific Northwest. Some of you may be familiar with the efforts to end coal exports. And of course, this is a great thing to do for communities here who don't want to be impacted by coal trains coming through and coal pollution here, as well as for the potential recipient communities in places like China, where they don't want to be burning this coal either. So making these connections and really working, people to people to try to, end our reliance on fossil fuels globally, I think is really important. Another thing we can look at is our consumption. About 30% of China's carbon dioxide emissions are related to trade. So that's not all of it, right? It's a lot of it has to do with China's own power needs, but that is a lot, and that has to do with China being a manufacturing center for the globe. So there's a really great website where you can check out a number of reports on brands and how their environmental performance looks in China, ipe.org. You may or may not need the CN, I'm not sure. And the name of this organization is the Institute for Public Environmental Affairs. They're a domestic organization in China, one of those Beijing-based groups that's doing really good work. And I think it's worth checking out and thinking about, it's not just what am I going to buy when I go to REI, of course, but it's what are these American brands that, are manufacturing in China and taking advantage of the situation in China, what impact are they having? So that's something I think that we as Americans can do a lot. And in fact, when Chinese activists wrote Apple to ask them to investigate what was going on with their factories in China, nothing happened. But when American consumers wrote Apple and asked the same question, a lot started to happen. So there's a lot we can do. I think also we need to push our leaders to send a consistent message to China in terms of the environment, and that we want to take a lead on the environment, and that we're not prioritizing profit over the environment anymore. So wouldn't that be great? With that, I wanted to share a few resources as well. Another thing we can do, of course, is learn more about China. I just gave you like a tiny little tip of the iceberg with this talk, and a place that I love to go to learn about environmental issues in China is chinadialogue.net. It's really top-notch investigative reporting from China on environmental issues that's then translated into English. And vice versa, they do translate both ways, it's bilingual. A fun, entertaining, and informative podcast I love to listen to is the Sinica podcast. It's emceed by this guy, Kaiser Kuo, who was a rock star American, who then went to China, and became a rock star, and then he became a podcast MC. And he does really, really fun podcasts. ChinaFacts.org, a lot of great commentary about energy issues and coal in China. FearingChina.org is a very interesting monograph that somebody sent to me, self-published, and is really about busting a lot of the myths that we hear from our corporate-controlled US media about China, and trying to sort of expose what some of the deeper, longer-term issues are in the US-China relationship. And then some fun reads at the very bottom. Mike Myers in Mongolia, a great look at northern China, looking at the past of that really interesting, complicated region, and then also the major changes going on there in terms of agribusiness coming in and taking over northern China's farming. Peter Hessler's Country Driving, 3 topics: cars, factories, and what's the third one? Oh, country life. A really fun read on China if you want to read something sort of smart and current about what life in China is like. I want to finally say a little something about Kissinger, who was the speaker before me. I found that actually to be pretty interesting. It was a little hard to hear him at times. I think that his basic point, and what I've read of his on China recently, is that it's in our best interest, the U.S.'s best interest, to remain friends with China, to not build up animosity, and I think that I can agree with that opinion. I think it's kind of a given. I don't fully trust him, though, because, in the name of U.S. national interest, Kissinger was behind Pinochet's 1973 coup in Chile, where democratically elected socialist leader was toppled and thousands of people were brutally murdered. He was involved in many war crimes during the Vietnam War, including using nerve gas on innocent civilians, and supporting the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the genocidal regime that tortured and murdered millions of its own civilians. So, in terms of US-China relations, Kissinger may have made a very positive contribution. I think that what he was involved in at the time of ping-pong diplomacy, I think, needs to be looked at in light of what else we were doing in Asia and the rest of the world at that time. And I think that I'll end my remarks there and open up the rest of the time that we have to questions and comments. Thank you. Thanks for that question. Because we're in the law school, I wanted to point out that many of China's environmental laws, not all, but a vast majority of them are modeled on U.S. environmental law. So there's that. That was actually one of the early, maybe environment has always been a bright spot. It was one of the early areas of cooperation for the U.S. and China after we got past ping pong. And looking at this issue. China didn't, the People's Republic of China didn't have environmental laws, as far as I understand, at that time. But in terms of, kind of more currently, my organization and many other international organizations have programs in China. Some are doing the kind of things that I do, where it's about providing funding. Others have staff there that do lots in Greenpeace, WWF, NRDC. Some of the big environmental groups that we have very robust programs there, and all of these are currently definitely under threat by a new law that China has passed on foreign NGOs, which comes into effect on January 1st of 2017. So it is a time in China when, quote unquote, Western thought is being looked at with more scrutiny, and how much the government can stomach in terms of big NGOs coming in, or maybe it's just a certain element of NGOs that they don't want. But this is a problem for a lot of us that are working at this level that we're having to look at. In terms of local groups themselves, as I mentioned in my talk, I do feel like it's a really positive time for them in terms of space opening up. And kind of ironically, at the same time that China has been passing a law on foreign NGOs that seeks to limit our sphere of influence there, a new charity law was passed in China, which makes it a lot easier for domestic NGOs to register and to fundraise. So but there's good and bad, right? There's acknowledgement that NGOs have a role to play. There's simultaneously kind of a fear of the West, and it's upon us to weather this political change. And there's been many political changes, and then we've had struggles trying to work in China in the past. So we'll work through it. At least I hope we do. But there has been a lot. I think that particularly in the field of environment, there's been a lot of exchange. Not just with U.S. groups, but also Europe, South America. There's been a lot of interchange in this field, and so I do think it is one area where even more could be done in terms of, and not just one way. It's got to be two-way, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from China. As I heard Amory Levin say the other day, brains are evenly distributed, one per person. So there's a lot of great ideas, right, coming out of China, and especially when you look at things like the rapid acceleration of solar and wind energy. I think those are things that we need to be really looking at. There's also a lot of government-to-government cooperation at the city level and the state level. I recently went to a meeting in California where it was the California-China Energy Cooperation Summit, and I was amazed at how many sort of governmental and quasi-governmental organizations based in California had cooperative programs in China, and a lot of it was technology exchange, capacity building, training, legal training. And then there's the cooperation kind of, there's universities. Lawrence Berkeley Lab and Tsinghua University now are cooperating now on this huge energy environment program. And then, I think that there is the top level cooperation that the media is talking about, which is the discussions that Xi and Obama and their advisors are having about climate issues and ivory, and that's really being touted as something that's going well in the relationship right now. I don't know if that fully answers it, but I think it's maybe a flavor for what I see, at least. Yeah.
And I would add as well, just to your point, and I guess this sort of also harkens back to some of the comments that you made to the last question about the role of civil society in environmental protection. in China and sort of the importance of that. And one a comment that you made in your presentation, Kristen, struck me about how the new environmental law allows NGOs to sue directly for environmental harms, which I think is actually sort of puts Chinese environmental law in that sense ahead of U.S. environmental law. I'm not an environmental lawyer, but my basic understanding of it is that in fact NGOs typically cannot sue for environmental harm unless they are directly harmed or for environmental activity, unless they're harmed directly by that activity, which they almost never are, right? They're usually sort of suing on behalf of the public benefit, and courts will say that you don't have standing to sue on behalf of the public benefit. You only have standing if you're suffering direct harm from that activity. And so, in that sense, Chinese environmental law is more advanced and provides more tools for redressing these harms than U.S. law does. So it is real. So that shows the potential power of sort of civil society in addressing some of these harms in China that actually has been a real problem. It's been a roadblock in the U.S.
A lot of the bigger NGOs in China have domestic funding sources. In the past 10 years in China, philanthropy has really taken off. It's not where it needs to be, but as new wealth accumulates, and there's been a few entrepreneurs that have been really out ahead of the curve and using their philanthropic projects to sort of paint a new picture of what it means to be wealthy in China. And I think that more and more people are wanting to donate, and use of social media, crowdsourcing is huge in China right now. So a lot of the larger organizations in China do quite well with domestic sources of funding. There's some private foundations. There's also corporate funding in China. Alibaba, China's Amazon has a really robust environmental focused foundation where they give out a lot of funding to not just Beijing-based, but also grassroots groups. A lot of the groups that I work with, and I think my impression is grassroots environmental groups across China, most of them, it's about 50-50 in terms of domestic and international funding. And if funders are unable to register in China under the new law, foreign funders, they will no longer be allowed to provide funding to grassroots groups in China. So that definitely could have an impact on their ability, in the short term at least, to survive. I do think there's the potential that gap could eventually be filled by domestic sources of funding within China. But it's, I think in the short term, it's definitely a concern for a lot of groups. That's a really good question. I'm trying to scrape. I feel like I heard about a potential suit that an organization wanted to try in Africa, but I don't know if that went anywhere. I think it's a really new area. There's just a few organizations in China that I'm aware of that are actually looking at the impacts of China overseas, which is it's huge. China has built hundreds, if not thousands, of dams in other countries. Many of them have major social and environmental impacts, and that's just one sector that I know about. But I don't know if it's legally possible or not. My guess is it probably would be, or it's a gray area that hasn't really been tested.
Let's have a round of applause.